As we saw in the last lecture, in the fall of 1789, the National Assembly set out to abolish the feudal privileges of the nobility. This, however, as we've seen, didn't prevent the peasants in the countryside from burning the manor houses of their nobles anyway, during that period known as the Great Fear, in order to destroy the documents that they saw as the instruments of their oppression. But not just in the countryside, but also in the city. The Paris mob injected itself into the events of the Revolution, beginning with the fall of the Bastille in July of 1789. And in this lecture, we will see how these violent events ultimately overtook the measured, reasonable policies and enlightened discussions by the representatives of the National Assembly, leading ultimately to the creation of a radical republic and a horrific period known as the Reign of Terror. Also in the fall of 1789, to address the financial crisis that had given rise to the calling of the Estates General initially, the National Assembly adopted a set of provisions in order to try and ensure that the French crown would be able to restore some measure of fiscal viability. On the 2nd of November, an imaginative and very creative response was introduced. All lands of the church were to be confiscated, and these lands were then to be used as security against the issuing of state bonds known as assignats. But the National Assembly, like so many governments, found that it needed continually more money, and so more and more assignats were printed, and their face value declined, inflation increased, and indeed the entire experiment began to unravel. More money was still needed, so some of the land that had been confiscated was then put on the market. This resulted in wild speculation, and wealthy Frenchmen made huge fortunes. However, the poor or landless peasants, those who couldn't afford to purchase land or get involved in this remarkable market in land, were alienated. They were angry because they were receiving no benefit from the nationalization of church property. So the members of the National Assembly, again, property owners, members of the established bourgeoisie, recognizing that the angry peasants might withdraw their labor, and land without peasants to work it has no value, they then protected this property by outlawing strikes, associations, and unions, indicating quite clearly at the beginning how the property-owning middle classes were in charge of the events. By confiscating the lands of the church, however, there was a problem. There had to be another mechanism to pay priests to support the churches, because previously the ecclesiastical establishment had largely been supported by the ownership of this 10% of the property in France. So on the 12th of July, 1790, the National Assembly promulgated the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. This was a remarkable piece of legislation because it too effectively nationalized the church. But unlike the nationalization that took place under Henry VIII in England, for example, in this case, the church became an integral part of the state. The clergy were civil servants. Moreover, the large number of bishops in France was reduced, and all the bishops were to be elected. They were to be elected by all voters, including non-Catholics. The salaries of the clergy were to be fixed. They were to be paid by the state. And every monastery, every convent in France was to be dissolved. And to ensure that there would be no movement away from a national church, all ecclesiastics, regardless of rank, were forbidden to apply to the Pope for confirmation of their offices. These events surrounding the civil constitution of the clergy resulted in a seismic division in France. A division that characterized the split that was arising in the nation between the jurors, that is, those who took the oath, those who swore to it, and the non-jurors, those who chose not to swear or who simply refused. Those who refused to swear constituted an interesting demographic in France. Almost all of the bishops agreed. Almost all of the bishops in France swore to the civil constitution, but only about half of the priests did. The bishops, after all, were political appointees. They were used to being political officers and being manipulated by the power of the crown and the state. The clerics, though, closer to the people, largely reflected the perspective of their diocese. Despite Voltaire's and Diderot's anti-clericalism, despite Voltaire's cry of écraser l'infâme, of crush the infamy, despite Diderot's suggestion that atheism is much preferable to superstition, these provisions drove many Frenchmen of all classes and of all political persuasions into opposition to the revolution. In the National Assembly, a number of representatives were sympathetic to the non-jurors. The non-jurors, moreover, realized that they had lost their leadership. As I said, the bishops had largely agreed. So they needed some measure of support and someone to look to try and get them out of this terrible spiritual mess. So they began to look for leadership ultramontes, across the Alps, across the mountains, to Rome. And they sought leadership from the Pope. And so whereas previously the French church was largely self-governing, a Gallican church from the middle of the 15th century, it now was divided, especially between those who defined themselves as ultramontanes, who sought solace in Rome, and those who were willing to compromise for the well-being of the state. This division also reflected a division in French society that was to have very profound results over a century. Traditional Roman Catholics were viewed by the left wing of the revolution as sympathetic to absolutism. They were seen as enemies of the revolution. But to be a juror, to have sworn to the oath that was required in the constitution of the clergy, was in the eyes of conservatives or traditional Catholics to be a radical atheist, against property, against justice, and against French tradition. These two sides never forgave one another, and to some extent there are memories of this division to this day in France. And in the 19th century, it would explode on a number of occasions, most importantly during the Dreyfus affair, when the same division once more was laid bare. The work of the National Assembly culminated in the Constitution of 1791. This was a document that was informed by the opinions of the Enlightenment, informed by those opinions that we've already investigated when we saw the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, the preamble to that Constitution which represented the ideals that were to inform it. The Constitution turned France into a constitutional monarchy, in which all of the privileges of the Ancien Regime were swept away in favor of a bourgeois social structure. A most evident principle was a separation of powers so praised by Montesquieu, indicating again how de l'esprit des lois, how Montesquieu's great book had an influence in shaping the mentality for this constitution. The king represented the executive, but his acts had to be approved by his ministers, and although he enjoyed a veto, that veto could delay legislation for a maximum of 4 years. Legislative authority was in a single chamber assembly, and it would hold office for only 2 years. And then there was a judiciary, a complex hierarchy of courts in which all of the judges were to be elected. Well, not just the national government and the judiciary, but local government was completely and radically restructured. All of the vestiges of feudalism, all of the memories of manorialism were abolished, as was the office of the intendant, that office that Richelieu had created in order to weaken the power of the nobility in the countryside. France was divided into 83 departments, départements, and these 83 departments were in fact to be exactly contiguous with the new bishoprics, the 83 new bishoprics, indicating again the relationship between church and state and the dependency of the church upon the new secular organization of the French monarchy. The departments were then divided into districts, or arrondissements, and these districts into municipalities or communes. All local officials were to be elected, of course, and each region was to be widely autonomous. This system was so effective, worked so well, and was again so rationally structured that it survives to this day. France is still divided into departments, arrondissements, and communes. The only difference is that they are not widely independent. They do not enjoy a measure of local autonomy. This would not survive the terror, nor would it survive Napoleon. And despite the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, French citizens were not politically equal under the Constitution of 1791. 1791. The population was divided between active citizens and passive citizens. Both groups enjoyed full civil rights under the law, but only active citizens, who were defined by the amount of tax they paid. They had to pay a certain fixed rate on their property to enjoy the right to vote or hold office. The result was only about half of the adult males in France were enfranchised. And of course, no women could hold office. We're still in the 18th century. Also, it wasn't a truly democratic system even then, because voters did not elect their representatives directly. They in effect chose a college of electors, who then chose the deputies of the Legislative Assembly. So if we look at this Constitution of 1791, the result of the first stage of the Revolution, what we see is a victory for the enlightened, property-owning, anti-clerical bourgeoisie. On October 1st, 1791, the new Legislative Assembly met under the new Constitution. The problems, though, were so evident, and the dangers and threats to the state so profound, that they instantly recognized that there was a serious danger to be faced. On the one hand, the émigré nobles, led by the king's two brothers, both of whom would eventually become king, Louis XVIII and Charles X, plotted with conservatives within France to overthrow the Constitution with the help of foreign armies. The original delegates, moreover, who had drafted this Constitution, had nobly, but foolishly, made themselves ineligible for re-election. Consequently, they were replaced by men with no experience whatsoever in representative government. We must remember that until 1789, there was no tradition of representative government. The Estates General hadn't met for 175 years, so there was no opportunity to gain experience in statecraft, the compromises necessary, and the organization and structure to achieve policy. And on top of that, there was the problem of the king. Louis XVI was completely hostile to the civil constitution of the clergy. He was a devout Roman Catholic, and he felt that the civil constitution was wrong and also hostile to French tradition. He also believed that he was left insufficient power under the 1791 Constitution. Because of this, in June of 1791, he and his family had tried to escape France. They reached as far as Varennes, but one of the disadvantages of having your profile on every coin in the country is that he was discovered at an inn as the horses were being fed and changed. And he was returned to Paris, again, virtually a prisoner, and whatever sympathy and loyalty the people of Paris and France had for their monarch evaporated, because it appeared as though the king himself was working against the revolution, willing to work with foreign powers to join his brothers and to support those émigré nobles and forces that wanted to undo the work of the Constitution. Well, it's obvious that the king would have difficulty with this, and it's obvious that there would be divisions based upon fundamental principles, such as the civil constitution of the clergy. But what about the rest of Europe? How did the events in France affect France's neighbors and the rest of the continent? Well, in some instances, these were seen as wonderful and splendid. The great English politician, Charles James Fox, rose in the House of Commons and said that it was the best thing that happened in the history of the world. The poet Wordsworth went to France and not only had an illegitimate child there, but also wrote that wonderful piece in the Preludes about how it was bliss to be alive in those times, but to be young was very heaven. But these were radicals. These were people who saw a new world being born, and they were committed to radical principles and ideas. They were in a minority. And those who had the greatest stake in these events outside of France were the ones who were most frightened. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II was Marie Antoinette's brother. Now, Leopold was perhaps the most enlightened of all of the enlightened despots. When he was Grand Duke of Tuscany before he became emperor, for example, he abolished capital punishment in the 18th century and was an extraordinarily liberal and open man. But he saw the dangers involved to his family, to his sister, and also to the principles of some form of orderly and stable government. So he joined with the King of Prussia, Frederick William II, to declare the Declaration of Pillnitz. The issuing of the Declaration of Pillnitz was an extraordinarily dangerous thing to do for the royal family, because what it said was that if any harm should come to the king or queen, then these forces of the Holy Roman Empire and Prussia would wreak exemplary vengeance upon the people of France and Paris. Well, the Declaration of Pillnitz really made war inevitable, because it drew a line that neither side could really not fail to cross at some point. War being inevitable, the French, realizing their weak position, decided to at least have the preemptive advantage. So in April 1792, the National Assembly declared war on Austria and Prussia. The war gave power to the most radical elements in the revolutionary leadership. It turned a situation that previously had largely been managed by bourgeois lawyers, heavily influenced by Enlightenment ideas, looking towards a reasonable compromise that would allow French tradition to operate, but in a rationalist way. It allowed them to yield the field of politics to the most radical of a radical party. We have to remember that in France before 1789, there were no political parties. There were no journals to determine ideology. There were no organizations and clubs that you could join in order to work your way up and to become associated with a political perspective. So it was necessary for there to be some form of association, some way to indicate your own political perspective and to find allies with that perspective in order to achieve some measure of political success. The way it worked in 1789 was simply one of where you chose to sit in the assembly. To the right of the Speaker of the Assembly sat the conservatives. So if you were conservative by temperament, you would sit then to the Speaker's right. This was a group who wanted to reform the existing system rather than to reconstruct it. They all wanted reform, but they wanted to leave it as something they knew only better. On the Speaker's left sat the radicals, the Jacobins and the Girondins. The Jacobins take their name from the Priory of Saint-Jacques. After the dissolution of the religious houses, many religious buildings were given to political groups and associations as meeting places. And the Jacobins, or the Society of the Friends of the Constitution, who took the name of Jacobins from Saint-Jacques, were given this place to meet. They were the most radical of all of the groups. They were Republicans. They wanted to leave nothing of the Ancien Régime, in fact, very little of French tradition in place at all. They were joined by the Girondins. The Girondins take their names from the region around the southwestern city of Bordeaux. This is the Gironde. Most of the leaders came from the Gironde, and they too were radicals. They were Republicans, and they also wanted fundamental restructuring of French society. The basic difference between them is that they believed in the autonomy of the regions, seeing France as a group of autonomous departments rather than a centralized state, which was the sympathy of the Jacobins. In the center sat the moderates. That is, those who made independent decisions, determined by the individual bill under discussion or on the present circumstances in which they found themselves. This was the group least driven by ideology. This was the group that determined how they would vote depending on what they saw at that moment is best for France. So indeed, it's from the seating plan of the French National Assembly in the Revolution that our modern political orientation of left, right, and center emerged. The only way to determine how you would vote with your fellows, how you would establish some measure of cooperative alliance, was where you chose to sit. As the Allied armies began to approach towards Paris, the radicals on the left called for troops to be raised. But the king, Louis XVI, vetoed the bill. He did so in hopes of an Allied victory. And he thereby divided the assembly between those who wanted to follow the rule of law and those who saw an opportunity to destroy the monarchy and create a radical republic. After all, Louis had the right to veto. It was his constitutional right, and those in the assembly who supported him said, we might not agree with the decision, but he has the right to do this. Those on the left, of course, said the king should not have this right because he is endangering the nation itself. In August of 1792, a Jacobin mob, infuriated by this situation, stormed the palace of the Tuileries in downtown Paris. The National Assembly itself was attacked and was terrorized. The people of Paris were also terrorized by these radical, violent individuals who wanted to reduce the capital to anarchy for their own purposes and to try and illustrate exactly how powerful this extraordinarily radical group really was. It had the desired effect. The moderates in the National Assembly who supported the king feared for their lives. They were afraid that being identified at all as part of the monarchist cause, or even willing to support the constitution that gave the king the right of veto, would cause them to be denounced by these radicals in the revolution, and they and their families and their property endangered. So they panicked. They panicked and they voted to imprison the royal family and to call for new elections. This again was another step that moved the revolution towards its most radical stage. Because what this event really indicated is that the radicals had assumed the upper hand. Those who were seen as opposing the revolution were indeed arrested at this point. They were sent before revolutionary tribunals. They were tried for treason. They were thrown in prison. And in the fullness of time, most of them would be executed. And an act of good fortune, at least for the radical cause, then intervened. Something that was seen as almost impossible happened. The French Revolutionary Army stopped the Allied advance in September of 1792 at the cannonade at Valmy. This was an unexpected victory because, after all, the French army was largely leaderless. It was suffering from the same kind of financial disasters that the rest of the nation suffered from. The soldiers weren't paid. They were badly trained in many instances. But this was a battle that really consisted of an artillery duel. The only part of the French army in which the officers were not required to have patents of nobility was the artillery officers, because it was considered ungentlemanly to kill people at a great distance. The cannonade at Valmy gave victory to this most violent perspective. And in fact, the Jacobins claimed victory to be theirs, and they used the opportunity to fully subvert the Constitution. And so we see it happening. All male citizens, including passive citizens who did not own enough property to qualify for the vote, and who had been disenfranchised under the Constitution of 1791, were granted the right to vote. Well, that wasn't enough. The Jacobins positioned thugs at every poll to ensure that only Jacobin supporters would cast ballots, again intimidating the electorate. The result was a foregone conclusion. The Jacobins won control of the new representative body, which had a new name, the National Convention. Events followed quickly. In 1792, on the 21st of September, France was declared a republic. The moderate constitution of 1791 was dead. It had lasted just a year and was destroyed by the pressure of war and terror. The First French Republic was an example of the totalitarian principles implicit in Rousseau, whose social contract became the revolution's Bible. All citizens had to yield their liberty, their property, and their rights to the general will. Churches were closed, or, as in the example of Notre Dame in Paris, the great cathedral of the capital, turned into temples of reason. The calendar was changed because, of course, the European calendar had a Christian origin. 1792 became the year 1. Paris was reduced to anarchy. The Commune fell into the hands of radical workers, and the city was prey to their radical excess. Louis XVI was publicly executed in January 1793. He was accused of treason for having tried to veto the bill that would have allowed the raising of soldiers to protect France. The Queen Marie Antoinette followed in October. Their son, the Dauphin, the heir to the throne, a young boy, was given to a radical working-class couple who apprenticed him to a shoemaker. Beaten, neglected, and abused in every way, the poor boy was dead by June of 1795. The National Convention became, in effect, a Jacobin dictatorship, led by Maximilien Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety. Robespierre was a Parisian lawyer and a rhetorician of great skill. He also was committed to some of the most dangerous ideas found in Rousseau, and his solution to the problems of France was to do what Rousseau was in fact trying to do. Rousseau said when he was writing the Contrat Social that he began by writing a book about politics and he finished by writing a book about virtue. So Robespierre wanted to establish a republic of virtue in which all of those within the republic would be forced to be free. The real power in the state was vested in the 12 members of the Committee of Public Safety. This was the organization that was responsible for state security in what was believed to be a dangerous time. And these 12 individuals supplanted the convention, becoming the only authority in a violent state. The terror had begun. By the spring of 1794, tens of thousands of Frenchmen had been fed to Madame Guillotine. They were aristocrats, they were tax collectors, they were known monarchists, there were large numbers of monks and nuns and priests. They were those against whom Jacobins had personal anger. It was a very odd group, but most of them consisted of aristocrats and those who were identified by these kangaroo courts, these citizens' tribunals, as being enemies of the state. Despite the shedding of so much French blood, and despite the fact that Robespierre, fearing for his own position and wanting to be above any other faction, began to guillotine his former associates and all of his rivals, he couldn't contain the events that ultimately would bring him to Madame Guillotine as well. He was unable to suppress all opposition, and it was clear that the only way the terror would end would be that Robespierre would have to die. He himself was arrested and tried, and he was sentenced to be guillotined. But he didn't want to suffer that humiliating end to which he had sent so many hundreds of thousands of his fellow Frenchmen. He tried to commit suicide. He missed. He blew off the bottom of his face and had to be tied up and quickly carried out so that the symbolic guillotining of Robespierre could occur. And with that, the reign of terror finally ended. The Committee of Public Safety was controlled. The Paris Jacobin Club was closed in order to end its radical activities. A partial restoration of Christian religion was permitted once more, and a new constitution was promulgated in 1795. France remained a republic under this constitution, and the assembly was now composed of bourgeois moderates, and again, those who had to hold a certain level of property to vote or hold office. The new executive, moreover, was a collective body, a committee, a directory, a directoire of 5 members. The reason for this is the dangers of one-man rule became altogether too clear, so now it was a committee. The directory gave France perhaps its most vigorous, honest, and well-managed government since Jean-Baptiste Colbert under Louis XIV. But there were insoluble problems. Attacked by the Jacobins on the left and the monarchists on the right within France, insurgents from whole areas in the country, such as the Vendée, allied armies still threatening France from without, and émigré nobles conspiring to overthrow the state. But worst of all, the Directory was forced to repudiate the public debt, making the holders of paper fortunes bankrupt. And worst of all, France was unable to enjoy peace. The Directory could not give peace to France. So it was in many ways doomed. And in November of 1799, the Directory fell to a military coup d'etat, led by a remarkable young man, a heroic artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte.